So we are now at lecture number 74 in our series on the Guide for the Perplexed, and we are at chapter 28 in part 2 of the Moreh Nevuchim, which is on page 334 in the Pines second book. And first of all, 74 in Hebrew is spelled is ayin daled. If you transpose the letters backwards, it spells the Hebrew word da, which means know, knowledge. So we've reached the level of knowledge. We've had up to lecture number 74. We can maybe say now that we know something. But just a little cute piece I thought we could start with. So chapter 28, if you remember, Rambam has established a few things, right? He took on Aristotle regarding the issue of the eternity of the world, right? Aristotle, who said that the world always existed, and Rambam said that no, that the Torah is based on the idea that the world didn't always exist, but there was a creation, that the Creator created the world. And Rambam explained to us why that was so important. Because the entire foundation of the Torah, of the whole idea that there's such a thing as a Torah and as a religion and as us living with a specific purpose, is the idea that God, as a creator, if God created the world, then there must have been a purpose, a point. He willed it into existence for a reason. What that reason is, we can sit and debate and scream and yell at each other, but a reason must exist, as opposed to if you stick with Aristotle's point, and if you recall, Aristotle's main argument was the laws of nature dictate that a world such as what we see around us exists, because the world exists because the laws of nature dictate that this is what should happen. So if the laws of nature dictate that today on December 24th, 2020, January 24th, 2024, then those same laws would have dictated that a million years ago, a billion years ago, a trillion years ago, and a quadrillion years ago. It doesn't matter. Those same laws should dictate the same universe. And then the Rambam said that even though some people would argue that if the world is always going to exist the way we see it, right, then it always must have existed. And that if you're going to argue that the world will one day change, in other words, that may cease to exist at some point, or at least cease to exist as we know it, then the world then that, in other words, and if the world had a moment that it was created, it must also have a moment when it will be destroyed or it will cease to exist as we know it. And the Rambam said that's not a good, you can't say that. That's not true, because he said there was a big difference, and this we talked about last week, between the existence of the universe came into being at a specific time. That rule, that law, which was the basis of the argument that Rambam is arguing against, which states that something that comes into existence also must have an end, has an expiration date. Everything that is created, everything that is made, right, in this world, everything that we see around us that comes into existence has an end date. Every living creature is born and eventually dies. Even geological formations have their time when they come into formation, but at some point they have an end date, even if it's 100 million years, but there is an end date. So Rambam says that rule itself was a rule that was put into place into the world of physics at the time of creation. So you can't apply that rule to creation itself. Now I want to make a point that I started making last time, which leads to one of Rambam's more controversial assertions, right? And that is that if the dictates of nature that are in place in the world today, and in this Maimonides and Aristotle will agree, dictate that the world will therefore continue to exist in the same way that we see it around us, then that necessarily creates a completely different vision of what the end of times, so to speak, is going to be, right? In other words, if you're the kind of person who feels that the world has an end date, there's some kind of Armageddon that's going to happen in the future, and everything's going to be destroyed or everything's going to be changed, the very nature of science and physics will change, right? Then one can imagine all the different various apocalyptic visions and ideas that have been expressed over the centuries, some within the Torah, some from various people over time, right? You can imagine all kinds of scenarios. But if, as the Rambam asserts, the laws of nature, even though they had a start date, don't have an end date, then when one envisions the future, one envisions a very, very worldly future, a future that looks exactly like what you and I see today, with the same laws of nature, with the same, it rains, it gets wet, and the plants grow, and the animals run around, and people are people, and everything is the same, right? So when one envisions the days of the Messiah, for example, and this is why in the Rambam and Mishnah Torah is famous for saying this, that the day of the future, the day that we yearn for, is not a day in which nature will change. The very laws of nature will be no different. We're still going to have to wake up in the morning and go to work. We're still going to have to go to sleep at night. We're still going to have to make peace with our friends. We're still going to have to pay our bills. So what then is the point of all of these visions of some kind of a future? We'll get to that as we study the Rambam more, but just to make it quick and easy, the Rambam emphasizes that the Yemos HaMashiach, the days of the Messiah, so to speak, are days in which people finally get their act together, right? There's world peace. We work together to make the world a better place. We have leaders that lead us in the right direction. That's the only difference. But there's no fundamental change in the laws of physics. That's why it's so important to the Rambam, that point that he made in the past, and why he's going to start spending today, what we're going to study today, and probably for the next, into next week, maybe even beyond, proving to us that this is the case, right? That the world and physics and the laws of nature as we see them will always exist. In other words, the world is eternal, right? Even though it had a start date, it doesn't have an end date. So what we have to understand to ourselves is what Rambam is really saying is that the laws of science will not change. The laws of physics will not change. Now, so if you remember back when we studied the first book of the Mor Nevuchim together, right? One of the main points that the Rambam was trying to bang into our heads then was the idea that God is incorporeal, right? We can't give God descriptions that make him into some kind of corporeal being. We can't give him eyes and ears and nose and mouth and hand, etc. And while, if we remember back then, that idea seemed so basic to us. And it seemed so basic to us because the ideas of Maimonides and those thinkers that followed him have bashed it into our heads to the extent that we take it for granted that religion believes that God is incorporeal. But it wasn't so simple in Rambam's day. And then the Rambam went and he started saying, in all of these verses that seem to suggest that God has a hand doesn't mean he has a hand, and so on and so forth. And to some degree, some of us might have wondered, well, it's enough of this already. He made the point. Well, he's going to do the same thing now, but to prove the same point. The fact that the laws of nature, the world, right, are eternal, is eternal, right? He's going to show that no matter how many times you see it in verses suggesting otherwise, seem to suggest that somehow the world is going to change in the future. Things are going to come to an end. There's going to be some mass destruction and it's all going to go kaput, right? That is even though some verses might suggest that, the Rambam is going to show us in a very, very similar way how it doesn't mean that. Okay, so now let's start from the beginning of chapter 28. So the first thing he's going to address is the book of Ecclesiastes, the book of Kohelet. And in the book of Kohelet, many people have understood some of the verses of Shlomo, of Solomon, who wrote the book of Kohelet, right, to suggest that the world has an end date, right? So he's going to deal with these verses in this chapter. So let's read it. Many of the adherents of the Torah, of our law, which translates as the Torah, have thought that Solomon, peace be upon him, believed in the eternity of the world. By the way, just this is my comment on the side. As the Rambam goes through this process, we learn a lot about how the Rambam thought about a lot of little different side issues as we get through it, many of which you may find interesting. So it is amazing that it should, so many people, in other words, many keepers of the Torah, so many rabbis with long beards, and my beard is getting a little longer, but next week it's going to go because I have to do army service next week. But so many people with long beards and big yarmulkes on their head, right, think that Shlomo thought that the world was always existed. There was never a moment of creation. And the Rambam says it's amazing that it should be imagined that a man belonging to the adherents of the law of Moses, our master, believed in the eternity of the world. I can't even imagine that somebody could even think that Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, thought that the world was eternal. If, however, someone deems, may God protect us, that in this he abandoned the opinions of the law, so then someone might argue, well, Shlomo seemed to suggest that in Kohelet, but that doesn't mean it's true. Shlomo was just wrong. I mean, Shlomo was far from perfect. At the end of Shlomo's life, we know, at least according to the a simple understanding of the verses, Shlomo went off the path at the end of his life, and based on the influence of his idolatrous wives, at least allowed, supported, maybe even participated in idol worship. So if you're going to say, well, that he abandoned the opinions of the Torah, right? And the Rambam says, God forbid you can even think this. How, if that's the case, if you're going to tell me that Shlomo wrote it in Kohelet, but it's not correct, and Shlomo was just wrong and he went off the path, well, then then how was it that all the prophets and sages accepted this from him and did not attack him on this point or blame him after his death, right? Then how come all of Chazal, we have the rabbis for hundreds of years, nobody attacked Shlomo, nobody attacked Kohelet and said, you can't believe that verse because it's wrong, right? And don't think for a minute that Chazal would stop themselves from criticizing Shlomo. The rabbis had plenty of criticisms for Shlomo, as had to be done in connection with the alien women and on other counts. The Rambam doesn't even list the other counts. Chazal are full of criticisms for Shlomo and his behavior at the end of his career, which was less than exemplary, right? He was a great, great, great leader, but at the end of his life, it's clear from the verses, and the rabbis were definitely called him to account on his going in the wrong direction. So then he says, some people think they want to support themselves by the words of the rabbis, where the rabbis said, when they were considering canonizing the Jewish canon, when they were deciding which books belong in the Tanakh, which books belong in what we now call the Hebrew Bible. So the rabbis considered various of the wisdom literature, one of them being the book of Kohelet, and many of them wanted to suppress the book of Kohelet and not put it in the official canon. And the reason was so some of these rabbis think, well, maybe that's what they wanted. That's what they were worried about. Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, thought that the world is eternal, and that's why the rabbis wanted to keep Kohelet out, right? So he says this is undoubtedly so. I mean to say, in this book, taken in its external sense, there are passages that incline to opinions far into those of the Torah and that need figurative interpretation, which Rambam is not going to go into. However, the affirmation of the eternity of the world does not belong to them. It's just not true. Even those they're simply not true. The problems that they had with Kohelet were other statements in Kohelet, not this. There is no text in it indicating this, and no text whatever is to be found in it that states explicitly that the world is eternal, a parte ante, right? So remember what we said, a parte ante versus a parte post. A parte ante means from this point prior, and a parte post means from this point on into the future. So a parte post, the Rambam says the world is eternal. In other words, from now on into the future, it's eternal. But from now back into the past, it's not eternal. And every time Shlomo HaMelech says in Kohelet a verse that suggests that the world is eternal, Rambam is telling us he's talking about a parte post, meaning from now on it's eternal, but not that it's always been this way, because there was a moment of creation, even according to Kohelet. However, when people saw texts indicating that the world is eternally parte post, they thought that he, Solomon, believed that the world was not created in time, and this is not so. Okay, so now he's going to go into some details. The text in the book, and the reason why all this is important is that when we have an idea that we know is true, either from a religious foundation, right? We know that it has to be religiously true, such as the idea that God is incorporeal, right? Or it has to be true from a scientific level. In other words, we know a certain fact to be the case, right? The Rambam is teaching us the main purpose of the book of the Guide for the Perplexed. What do you do when you see verses that seem to indicate otherwise? How do you read them? How do you learn them without having this cognitive dissonance between what you know to be true and what the verses seem to be saying? And when we study these things in the Rambam, even though it might feel tedious, he's giving us those skills so that when you and I encounter other such contradictions, we then know how to read the verse and understand it so that we can at least try to attempt to relieve that cognitive dissonance in our mind and come to some unified truth. So here goes his example. So in the text in the book regarding the eternity, a parte post of the world reads, right? And the earth abideth forever, right? So that's a verse in Ecclesiastes 1:4. Okay, so that's in the beginning. The olam la'olam omedes, right? Right. So the world lasts forever. So that's the verse. But those who are not aware of this subtlety, those who don't understand the difference between a parte post and a parte ante, these fancy Latin words that were thrown around, I think they're Latin. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. But those that were not aware of this subtlety resorted to the explanation during the time predetermined for it. So they said, what does he mean when he says le'olam? And people point out that Reb Sadia actually says this. So what does he mean when he says forever? The world's not eternal. The world had a start date, right? So they thought that they tried to get away with it by saying, well, he doesn't really mean forever. He means for as long as the earth. Remember, the word la'olam in Hebrew, which is translated as forever, also means for the universe. Olam means universe, right? So it didn't really mean forever. It means for as long as the universe exists. And they similarly explained his words, yet all the days of the earth, as referring to the predetermined length of its life. Would that I knew. Remember that the profound difference between a person who thinks that way and a person who thinks of the Rambam's way, and why it's so important to the Rambam that he laid this point out. The profound difference between a person who thinks that this world has an expiration date, who thinks that the rules of science are only temporary. So such a person envisions a certain type of apocalypse, a certain type of Armageddon, a certain type of whatever visions of the future. And I don't need to tell you, but many religious people within Judaism, and certainly from religions other than Judaism, have these types of images. Rambam is emphatically telling us that that's not the case. The rules of science are forever, right? They're not going to change. Whatever's going to happen at the end of times, whatever that even means, right? And according to Rambam, there is no end of times. The term doesn't even make sense. But whatever is going to be in that future that we're looking towards is not something that's supernatural, okay? It's very natural. Would that I knew what is said with regard to David's words. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to say that many times in the Tanakh, the word le'olam is mentioned, and it's very clear that it's not eternal. Hashem, in the same sentence that he tells David, I am making my covenant with you forever, says
Right.
only if your sons keep the covenant. And that's what David told Solomon as well.
You're making a very good point, and Rambam is going to deal with that in a minute, okay? And not specifically that statement, but a similar one, but that very point. Although I will like to tell you, there's a famous Rashbam, right? Rashbam, who was the son-in-law of Rashi, who actually states one of the famous places where it says that is when it says by a slave, right? When a slave, if he wants to stay with the master after 6 years, he gets a puncture in his ear. And the Torah says, Vavadola olam, and he serves forever. And the rabbis teach us that olam doesn't really mean forever. It means for a long time, which happens to be until the Yovel, until the Jubilee year, right? So Rashbam over there says, and this is one of these Rashbams that people have gone crazy over, he says, no, the real meaning of the word is the actual forever, right? Chazal, the rabbis, darshan and explain that when it comes to halachic implications, he only stays until Yovel. But the actual simple, plain understanding of the word really means forever. But the Rambam is going to explain it a little differently, dealing with the question that you brought up. I'm glad you brought it up, but wait 2 minutes, we'll be there. Okay? So, and I'll point it out to you to make sure we don't lose it. So then he says like this. In this verse that he just quoted from Tehillim, it says Olam Va'ed, which means forever and ever, or forever and on, right? So do not point to eternity a parte post, right? If that word, right, if you're going to tell me that la'olam va'ed doesn't really mean forever, and it really means a specific amount of time, then when David said, right, that God is forever, right, then, and it doesn't really mean forever, then you're telling me that God has a certain duration. So how could you say that? God can't have a duration. God has to have a specific, God cannot possibly have a specific amount of an expiration date. That doesn't make sense. Right? For the scriptural text with reference to his eternity apart to both, the Lord shall reign forever and ever. So therefore, the Rambam answers it, and this is going to deal with Yosef's question. You know that the word olam does not signify eternity aparte post. When you just say leolam, right, and you don't say leolam va'ed, so then that translation of leolam, forever, which means with an expiration date for the existence of the universe, right, that does not mean forever a parte post, unless it has the word ad, which may come either after it, olam va'ed, or ad olam. So if it says olam va'ed, Rambam says this is a rule, and you'd have to look through the entire Tanakh and see if this applies to the Hebrew, right? Consequently, when Solomon says abideth forever, then his statement is less than David's statement, which is forever and ever, olam va'ed. So if it's so, this answers the problem that Yosef was bringing up. When God says that I'm making David's kingship forever, that's with an expiration date. That means a long, long, long time. But it doesn't mean forever. But if God says forever and ever, then that means, or if the Torah says forever and ever, then that is truly forever. So David, peace be upon him, likewise makes clear and manifests the eternity, a parte post of the heavens, and the permanence in immutable sense. In other words, don't think that David thinks that God, God forbid, has an expiration date, because David says in a different verse, praise ye the Lord from the heavens, and so on. For he commanded, and they were created. He hath established them forever and ever. He hath made a statute which shall not be transgressed. So this is what, in other words, it lasts forever and ever, so it means for all time. He means by this that the statutes which he has laid down will never be changed. Yosef, I hope that deals with what you asked. But yes, it's true that when the Torah uses the language le'olam, if you leave aside what I mentioned from the Rashbam, then le'olam doesn't necessarily mean forever, unless it says le'olam va'ed or ad olam. He means by this that the statutes which he has laid down will never be changed, that the world will be forever, and the statutes, meaning the laws of science that govern nature, will never be changed. For the word statutes alludes to the statutes of heaven and earth, which have been mentioned previously. However, he makes it clear that they are created. That the same David also says, for he commanded and they were created. Hutzivav and Ivro. David clearly states that there was a creation. God made a commandment and then they were created. Jeremiah, peace be upon him, says, who giveth the sun for a light by day, and the statutes of the moon and the stars for light by night, and so on. If these statutes depart before me, so this quote from Jeremiah, if you look at it carefully, is stating there was a creation, so it didn't last forever, a parte ante, right? But they're going to last forever, which means they do last forever, a parte post. Those laws of nature will remain the same. Thus, if this matter is pursued, this doctrine will be found not only in Solomon's words, not only if we analyze Shlomo's words, but the truth is we find it all over the place. He just quoted it from David. He quoted it from Jeremiah, right? So, and you'll find it all over. On the other hand, Solomon himself has likewise stated that these works of the deity, I mean the world and what is in it, right? The creation of God, even though they are made, are permanently established according to their nature forever. For he says, that whatsoever God doeth, it shall be forever. Nothing can be added, nothing can be taken away. Again, that's in Ecclesiastes. Thus he imparts in this verse the information that the world is a work of a deity and that it is eternally parte post. He also states that the cause of its being eternally parte post, namely in his words, nothing can be added, nothing taken from it, right? For this is the cause of its being forever, right? It lasts forever because the rules can't be changed. It is as if he said that the thing that is changed, and usually, right, what does it mean? He said it was created perfect. So something that changes has to change for a reason, right? Either because there's something missing, right, in it, so it changes, right? Like, God forbid a person passes away, he changes because the life force, his soul left him, so it changes and it ceases to exist, right? Or so there's some kind of deficiency, something is not there that used to be, or because of some excess that is not needed and should be gotten rid of, right? The nature of certain things can change because there's too much of something and that has to leave, so it changes, right? Now, the works of the deity, however, are most perfect, and with regard to them, there's no possibility of an excess or deficiency. There's never any cause for a change because it was created perfectly. The laws of nature were created with a perfect design. Accordingly, they are of necessity permanently established as they are, for there is no possibility of something calling for a change in them. He has also, as it were, stated an end for what has come to exist and given an excuse for what changes. Right? So he also, in the process of telling us about the eternity of the world, he also explained to us why temporal things, things that are creations that we see around us, are not permanent, right? Because saying in the final part of the verse, and God hath so made it that they should fear before him, right? The reason God has made it this way so that people should fear him, should see him. So, no, he refers to the production in time of miracles. The what he's referring to there in Ecclesiastes in that verse is the fact that God created miracles. He created signs within this world. The subject of miracles he's barely touching on now. We've touched on it a few times in little bits, and I promise we're going to get to it in much more depth. So I know those antennas went up in most people with this sentence, but I don't think that now's the right time to deal with miracles, because we're going to deal with that in depth and what that means. So he's assuming that you already read, 10 chapters from now, but we didn't. So we'll get there. And saying after that, that which has been is now, and that which has already been, and God seeketh that which is pursued, right? So if he's saying there's nothing new, right? Everyone knows there's nothing new under the sun. These are some of the most famous quotes from Ecclesiastes, right? And that which is, whatever I see today, it's happened already. Whatever you see tomorrow is going to happen again, right? So it might make you think, well, that means if I back up that statement 100 years, 1,000 years, a million years, that means the world was eternal. It doesn't mean that, right? The author states that he may be exalted, desires that which exists should continue, and that its various parts should be consecutive to one another. So he doesn't mean to say that the world is eternal. As for his mention of the perfection of the acts of the deity and of its being impossible to add or to take away from them, which also might suggest, right? That almost sounds like Aristotle's argument, right? If these rules that govern the universe are so perfect and they therefore result in a universe, right? Then those perfect, they should be perfect all the time, even a billion, even a trillion, even a gajillion trillions years ago, right? But what he's saying is the master of those who know had already clearly stated this, saying the rock, his work is perfect. What he means is that all his works, I mean to say his creatures, are most perfect. In other words, it doesn't mean they're not, there's some of them might be born, some of them might die, and some of them come, some of them go. But in the way he made them, that's perfect, right? There's no deficiency at all commingled with them. There's no superfluity. God didn't make extra people. He didn't make extra lions. He didn't make extra mosquitoes, right? Every single creature, every single creation is done the way it should be, according to the rules that God put in play. Similarly, all that is being accomplished for and by the created things is absolute justice and follows from the requirement of wisdom, as shall be made clear in some of the chapters of the treatise. These are really big ideas. The idea that everything that happens is justice brings a lot of questions. The whole issue of theodicy, the nature of evil, why could people suffer? Important questions, which I'm not dodging. I'm just dodging for now because the Rambam just brings them up very briefly, but as he says, will be made clear later. So we can see how Rambam deals with these questions later. Anyway, so the bottom line is that Ecclesiastes doesn't mean that the world always existed, but it does mean that the world always will exist. I'll stop here just for a moment if there's any comments or questions before we start 29. And just FYI, 29 is kind of long. If anyone that flips through the next few pages, there's no way we're going to do it all today, but I think we can start it today, and do part of it, and we'll see how far we can get. But meantime, any questions, discussion items, comments, anybody angry about anything, go ahead.
Well, I had one question. Go ahead. Billy, were you talking? Oh. I had looked ahead and I saw the extraordinary length of the next chapter.
Right.
Technically, if we know, how did he write this? Did he write, he presumably did it by chapter. I mean, do we know anything about how he addressed writing? He made the length and how he divided this up, and did he have an outline?
I'm not sure if we know. I mean, we do have contemporary manuscripts in his own hand, but they do exist. But
did he write this in a series of letters to this prize student of his? So each chapter would be a separate letter?
I don't think it was, I think that's known, but I don't know the answer. I don't think they were like a whole bunch of, like 100 some different letters.
Okay.
I have to look that up. If someone could find that for me, I'd appreciate it. But the entire book was written as a addressing his student. But remember, it was published. I mean, so to speak, it's not published. There was no such thing as a printing press then, but it was released to the public and started being copied and published in his lifetime. In his lifetime, it was already translated into Hebrew for the public, so that not just the Judeo-Arabic reading public, but even the Hebrew reading public could read it. And then after his life, it was translated in other languages. But I don't know. Did he write? It's interesting, because we have in the Cairo Geniza, when the tremendous amount of discarded old manuscripts and papers and letters that were found in the synagogue in Cairo that are now, I think they're being studied by scholars. There's thousands and thousands of things that were found over a century ago, but they're still going through them. So there's a lot of letters in there that in the Rambam's own hand, right? So the scholars are very familiar with his handwriting. I mean, remember, he was an important leader of the Jewish community. He was an important physician, philosopher, corresponded with a lot of people. So, and in one place, and you can look online, they found Rambam's like a doodle paper, right? Right, where he was doodling. And when he was doodling, at least it's the best way to understand it. But it wasn't pictures, although there are examples of his pictures. One of his doodles created a whole storm about the shape of the menorah, but we can discuss that another time too. But on the doodle sheet that I was saying is fascinating because he was writing words, right, in both Hebrew and Latin characters. And it's the only example of the Rambam writing words in Latin characters. And he was writing words in a dialect, which seems to be some sort of dialect of Spanish, which nobody speaks anymore. So there's all kinds of debates as to what exactly, how much Spanish he knew, how much Spanish he spoke. Because remember, he, as a child, he grew up in Spain. So like, how familiar he was or wasn't with Latin characters. Was he just trying to play with the letters to see if he could figure them out? Because almost all, but he was familiar with Arabic characters and very familiar, obviously, with Hebrew. Most of his Arabic was written with Hebrew characters, right? That's how Jews wrote Arabic in those days when they spoke to, much like Jews of more recent times wrote Yiddish in Hebrew characters. But that doodle, you can look it up. Maybe I'll have to find it, but it's just interesting. Whether or not he actually wrote outlines, he's one of the most organized thinkers ever. Like he was almost OCD in being organized, right? Like the Mishnah Torah, he took the entire Talmud, which is arguably the most disorganized bunch of religious texts in history in the world. I mean, I don't mean that as an insult. Anyone that studied Talmud sees how completely disorganized. Within one page, you can bounce to 17 different subjects, right? And he took the whole thing and organized it into the Mishnah Torah. So he was very, very organized. I even saw some psychologists writing that he may have had some kind of almost a disorder where he saw this big massive things. He just had to separate it up into categories, right? Anyway, I'm going way off track, yeah. So that any other comments on 28 before we go on to 29?
I do have a couple of questions.
Yes.
One is the example that you gave, I think at the start of the lecture, that there's a quote that says, "And the earth abideth forever," and it has lit olam in braces beside
Right.
it. But you also said that lit olam not accompanied by va'ed does not mean forever. It means for a long time or for a period of time. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what the Rambam did say at the end, right? So yeah, so he granted that you could say that le'olam just means I want to look at that. Pause. Give me 1 second. Yeah, it's v'ha'aretz la'olam omedes, right? Yeah, but then the Rambam did say later that la'olam on its own doesn't necessarily mean forever, but could mean for a specified amount of time. Yes.
So it could be in some context, it could mean for olam by itself could mean forever, and it could in other contexts it could mean a
Yes.
finite period of time.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Okay. Any other points? Go ahead. All right. So let's hit 29. I'm only going to do a little bit of 29, but 29, I'll admit, is going to be a little bit of a drag, but it's important to go through the drag. And I'll tell the reason being, because again, the more examples we see of how the Rambam deals with these perplexities, right? How he deals with these contradictions between the idea that he believes to be true, which is in this case the foreverness of the laws of nature, when they seem to conflict with various texts. I'll show you how he deals with it. And if you remember, when way back when we discussed the issue of incorporeality, one of the ways he proved that his path of understanding these verses is appropriate is he brought examples in which everyone will admit that the verses doesn't mean exactly what they say, right? And then once I could show you that example, then I could say, well, if everyone admits it over here, then why can't you say the same thing over here to this other verse and say that it doesn't mean exactly that, but it means something else? All right. So that's going to be the method that he's going to use. So let's start. Know that if one does not understand the language of a human being whom one hears speaking, one indubitably knows that he speaks, but without knowing what he intends to say, right? If I started speaking in Swahili right now, unless there may be a Swahili speaker among us, but assuming there isn't, all of you would know that I'm talking, but you would have no idea what in the world I'm saying, right? Neither would I, but that's besides the point. Something of even graver import may occur. Sometimes you might hear in someone else's speech words that in the language of the speaker indicate a certain meaning. And by accident, that word indicates in the language of the hearer the contrary of what the speaker intended. And by some crazy coincidence, somebody might, in one place, a person might use a word, right? And I remember watching a movie a while ago where apparently in certain parts of the Middle East, this gesture is like an insult, right? In America, it means like, yeah, that's good. I'm with you. It's all good, or something like that. But in certain parts of the Middle East, this is kind of like giving somebody the finger, what we would do in the United States. And in this movie, it was this woman who was kind of involved in one of these Iranian groups that was doing stuff that the Iranian religious authorities wouldn't be happy with. I can't remember the details anymore. And one of the Iranian police officers that was enforcing their rules, pulled them over, and they asked the guy in the front, like, is everything okay? And the guy was American, and he said, yeah. And the cops got so mad that he gave him that gesture, right? And somehow, so then he pulled them over and searched them, and he found that they were doing things they weren't supposed to, and they got into all kinds of trouble just because of the misunderstanding of what that gesture meant. So the same thing could happen with words. Thus, the hearer will think that the signification that the word has for the speaker is the same as signification for him. I might think that you meant the same thing that I think you meant, but really you didn't mean that. You really meant something else. For instance, if an Arab hears a Hebrew man, so let's say you have an Arab who speaks Arabic and you have a Jewish guy who speaks Hebrew. The Hebrew guy says the word ava, aleph, vet, hey, right? Aleph, vet, hey, which means to desire, to want something, right? Lehit avot means to want something, to desire, or or he wishes, he wants something to be a certain way. The Arab will think that he speaks of an individual who is reluctant with regard to some matter and refused, right? Which is, in Arabic, it means to refuse or to decline. I don't know Arabic, but I'll trust the Rambam on this one, right? So you might, the Hebrew only wish to convey that the individual is pleased with the matter. So I tell you, hey, how'd you like dinner last night? And the Hebrew guy says that he desired it. The Arabic guy thinks he's saying I hated it. So the exact opposite of what he was trying to say is what the message the person hears, right? So this is similar to what happens with the multitude. Rambam says this is the same thing when so many people read the Tanakh with regard to the speech of the prophets. When they read the words of the prophets and they think they mean all kinds of things that they don't mean. They read the words of the prophets who talk about blah, 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 and he's going to give examples soon, right? And they think it means all kinds of stuff. And really they meant the opposite, right? Or maybe if not the opposite, they meant to say something else entirely, accepting certain portions that they do not understand at all. Sometimes they read the words of the prophet, they don't even know at all what they're talking about because they don't understand the language. And what Rambam means here is not necessarily that they don't understand Hebrew. They might understand Hebrew, but they don't understand the way that that prophet speaks. Okay? So as it says, the vision of all this is become unto you as the words of a book that is sealed, right? That's a verse in Isaiah, which so the point being that, like, you don't even understand what the prophet is saying at all, right? Because you don't understand how this prophet speaks, the kinds of metaphors that he uses when he expresses his ideas. With regard to other portions, they understand what is the contrary of or contradictory to the true meaning. Sometimes they see the opposite, as it says, and you have perverted the words of the living God, right? From Yirmiyahu, from Jeremiah. And know that every prophet has a kind of speech peculiar to him. So here's the Rambam is giving us a key. In order to understand the prophet, you need to study that prophet, because each prophet has a way that he talks, right? And when you read the prophets, you get a sense, right? If you pay attention, you get a sense for the type of metaphors that prophet likes to use, the types of comparison he likes to draw, right? The types of visions he likes to describe, right? And then you could understand, get a better idea, which is where the language of that individual, which the prophetic revelation peculiar to him causes him to speak to those who understand him. Each prophet, based on all kinds of factors, has a different manner of speech, a different way of talking. And he's going to analyze, Isaiah, who's like the world's favorite prophet, right? And the prophet who speaks in such beautiful metaphor and such beautiful poetry, and he's going to demonstrate to us how it's so obvious to anyone that reads this poetry, gets and understands that when he uses certain terms, he doesn't mean them literally. I want you to think for a moment of like one of the most famous verses in the Bible, period, right? And certainly one of the most famous verses of Isaiah, and think how it relates to the subject that Rambam was just talking about, how the laws of nature don't change. And how about, and the lion shall lay with the sheep, right? So these types of metaphors, right? Does it really mean that in the future lions aren't going to hunt deer anymore, right? Does it really mean that the wolves are going to eat grass? Like, is that what he really means, or no? What Isaiah means he's speaking the way he usually speaks. He means that those people and those cultures that prey upon others in violent ways will stop doing that and stop preying upon each other, right? That should be obvious. But there are people that walk around thinking that in the future, the laws of nature are going to change and lions are going to stop eating animals, okay? That's not the answer, what Rambam is going to use, but I want you to think and understand why this is so important. When Rambam just told us that the laws of nature aren't going to change, right? And you read Isaiah and he talks about visions of the future, right? Now somebody might actually beat a sword into a plowshare in the future, right? It may actually happen, right? We may go and take tanks and make them into implements, of building nice buildings and using them for more constructive purposes. However, the point of that image of beating swords into plowshares is not to tell us that anyone is actually going to take a sword and make it into plowshare. Like, it may happen, like I said, but that's not the point. The point is the image, the idea that instead of using our resources for war and for fighting and for violence, we're going to use our resources for something much more peaceful. So therefore, those are just some examples from Isaiah, but let's see how the Rambam plays this out. After this preface, you ought to know that in the speech of Isaiah, peace be upon him, it very frequently occurs, where in the speech of other prophets, it rarely occurs, because Isaiah uses the kind of imagery that not all the other prophets use. So when he speaks of the fall of a dynasty or the destruction of a great religious community, the actual Arabic word that Rambam used here was ummah, right? Ummah is interesting because the word is in Hebrew also. And in Hebrew, ummah means a nation. In Arabic, it also means a nation. But after the Quran, right, the word ummah came to mean by Arabs, by Muslims, it means to refer to the community of Muslims, a religious community, right? So that's why the Pines here, it wasn't sure how to translate ummah. Does ummah mean a religious community? Does it mean a nation? You can debate that, but that's the term in the Arabic that Rambam wrote the book, and he used the term ummah. So which aspect of ummah was he talking about? You can debate. But regardless, he used
Even Farrakhan calls it the nation.
yeah, because he used the term the nation of Islam. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Right. So, but and it comes it comes from the ambiguity of this term ummah, which is both an Arabic and a Hebrew word, right? But like in Arabic, it has a different connotation. So he uses such expressions as the stars have fallen, the heavens were rolled up, the sun was blackened, and the earth was devastated and quaked, and many similar figurative expressions. This is similar to what is said by the Arabs with regard to someone whom a great misfortune has befallen. They say his heavens were cast upside down upon his earth. So we use all of these lofty terms about heavens and earth and mountains and earthquakes and so on. In the same way, when he describes the prosperity of a dynasty and renewal of happiness, when he's not talking about destruction, he's talking about prosperity. He calls them an increase of the light of the sun and the moon, a renewal of the heavens, a renewal of the earth, and so forth. Just as when describing the destruction of an individual or religious community, an ummah again, or a city, they ascribe to God in relation to the latter the states of anger and wrath. And when describing the prosperity, they ascribe to God the states of joy and gladness. Accordingly, they say about states of anger with regard to men or communities, he went forth and he went down, he roared, he thundered, he gave forth his voice, and many similar such expressions. These are all just figurative expressions. He ordered, he said, he acted, and he did, and so on, as I shall set forth. Similarly, when a prophet gives information as to the destruction of the people of a certain locality, he sometimes substitutes for the people of that locality the whole human species. And he gives example when Isaiah is talking about the exile of the Jewish people. He said, and the Lord will remove man far away. And there, it's clear from the context, if you look there, that he's referring to the desolation of Jerusalem when the people that resided in it, which were the people of Judah, were expelled. He refers to the destruction of Israel. And Zephaniah, a different prophet, says, and I will cut off man from the face of the earth, and I will stretch out my hand upon Judah, which is clear from the context that when it says cutting off man from the earth, he was referring to the destruction of the nation of Judah. Know this also. It's getting close to 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock, depending on where you are. But I want to I should stop. So he's going to continue on this topic, and it'll give us a chance to delve a little bit and to feel the grandeur and beauty of the language of the prophets, most specifically Isaiah, which makes his book such a spectacularly beautiful book to read. But he uses that language in order to inspire a sense of awe or dread, depending on the particular passage. But everyone knows that he's a poet, right? Everyone knows that these images are not meant to say that the heavens are going to collapse upon the earth, or that the earthquakes are going to destroy the planet or anything. Everyone understands he's using metaphors to talk about great world events and so on that are either great and wonderful or great and awful. So these are the things where he's going to go through. And once he establishes that we all agree on that, then he's going to say, well, therefore, these other places, which you might think indicates that the world is, that the laws of nature have an expiration date, I will show you that it doesn't mean that, because I'm going to interpret those verses in a different way. So that will do 29. I'll try to get through 29 next time, but not going to make any promises. But anyway, let's give a few minutes now for the next. We've got about 7-8 minutes to have questions. So fire away if anyone has any comments.
I have a question. Where did Maimonides get the idea that the history of or the future history of the earth is eternal? I mean, or that the earth is eternal, and was that a holdover from Aristotle's philosophy?
Yeah, definitely. So in other words, he He only disagreed with Aristotle on the what is called the a parte ante, right? But
Yeah.
about the a parte post, he agreed. Because remember, the Rambam believed in the laws of nature being built in and locked into the way the world exists, right? So the same argument that Aristotle used to say that the world always existed, Aristotle used to say that the world will always exist, right? And Rambam will therefore agree on the future part. It's only on the past part he disagreed because the Rambam explained to us that the very laws of nature themselves were also created at the time of the creation. So you can't tell me that the laws of nature mean that the world always existed if the laws of nature didn't exist until the world existed, right?
Mhm.
But you can use that same argument for the future because now the laws of nature do exist. And it's an extremely influential point. Whenever, if Rambam is going to spend chapter after chapter after chapter banging this into our heads, it's because he felt that it's very important for what he believed was the proper religious philosophy, right? And he takes away a lot of the supernatural ideas of the days to come that exist in many other pockets and other thinkers within our religion and other religions, right? And which brought a lot of his critics from the more traditionalist camps would say, well, what do you mean there's not going to be a resurrection of the dead, right? That's certainly a counter to the laws of physics, right? So exactly how's that going to happen? So they said if you read Rambam, you'll certainly get the idea that there's no such thing. And a lot of scholars actually think that a lot of scholars say that Rambam really was guilty of thinking there's no resurrection. And meanwhile, Rambam was the one who put in the 13 principles of faith that there will be a resurrection. So what does that mean? What does a resurrection mean? So the Rambam is going to have to come up with an explanation, right, for that. Like, what does a resurrection mean if not a complete change in the laws of nature, right? So it gets the Rambam into a bit of a pickle. But we'll deal with these things both in this book, and if you guys hang out with me for another several years, we could follow this up. Rambam wrote a whole book called the treatise on the resurrection of the dead, the Mamar Tchiat HaMesim, in order to answer his critics. And then, of course, there are scholars that debate: was the Rambam just writing apologetics? Was we can get to that. But these are the things that make this book so that made it so controversial. You can imagine how some people, it really shook up their world, their religious worldview, you know. But it was very important to the Rambam that we know that the laws of nature are the laws of nature and they ain't going to change, right? How does that play miracles? I promised you we'll get to miracles.
Mhm.
All right, a couple more minutes and make time for one more question, maybe, if there are any.
You've convinced me that if we didn't subscribe to the idea that God created the heavens and the earth, it would shake the foundations of our Torah learning, because then what's the whole purpose of it all?
Right.
Did you give me a similar viewpoint? Why is it so important that the world always exists? I've never thought of that, frankly. And of course, scientifically, we've always learned that, yeah, the sun may explode some point, billions of years in the future. And I've never found that to be disruptive of my Torah sense of things.
Yeah. Well, the Rambam does seem to grant that some people imagine, right, and he doesn't call them heretics, that the world does have an expiration date, right?
Right.
But however, the Rambam himself felt it was very important. He didn't say that it's required for the foundations of the Torah to believe that the world will always exist, right? And remember, when the Rambam says the world will always exist, it's synonymous with saying the laws of nature will always exist, right? So according to the Rambam, he himself felt that that was very, very important, right? And I can imagine a lot of reasons why he thought it was very important, right? Mostly because the Rambam in general veered away from supernatural explanations of anything, right? Because if the world, if in 1,000 years something's going to happen all of a sudden and everything's going to change, right? Well, then that can happen tomorrow too, right? It can happen this afternoon, right? I can walk outside and I don't know, instead of the whatever, it's lightning will strike and who knows, crazy things. Not lightning is actually natural, but something crazy is going to happen, right? And I'll just start using supernatural explanations for anything and everything, right? God is intervening in this and God is doing that and miracles are happening here. Rambam is trying to veer us away from using miraculous explanations for things that happen in this world and for making us think that somehow tomorrow I'm going to wake up and everything's miraculously going to be different, because that's not what it's going to be, you know? So the Rambam was very important, right? But whether it shakes the foundation of all religious belief, the Rambam never said that about this idea, right? You can be a religious believer and think that the laws of nature are meant to be suspended. You can be. It's just that wouldn't be very Maimonidean. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, no, very good.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Okay.
Time for one quick question.
Yep.
Le'olam, again, going back to my first question, le'olam in some contexts does not mean forever. And it just means for a certain period of time.
Right.
And we infer from the context of its use, whether it's a shorter period of time or an infinite period of time. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, usually it's going to mean le'olam, which would then mean for the length of the olam, of the world, whatever that time period is, right? That's one way of understanding it in many cases. But in other cases, it's understood to mean a long time, right? Right? Which then can be interpreted by the rabbis in the usual fashion of the oral law, right? Of the oral tradition. Well, we have a tradition that this long time is referring till the Jubilee, which is in the example of the slaves, right? Or this one means until whenever, I don't know, each in context. It leaves it open to a lot of interpretation once you do that, but that's the nature of the Torah. I mean, these words, every word has 1,000 interpretations. And remember that particular Rashbam that I said is a famous one because a lot of people don't like that. You know, a lot of people got very upset with that Rashbam. Like, what do you mean, Chazal? The rabbis say that it means till the Jubilee, right? What do you mean that the simple meaning of the verse is one thing, and we derive an actual law, which contrary to the simple meaning of the verse? Go ahead. Somebody was going to say something. But you know, anyway, so that's just an interesting fact. Rashbam was interesting because he is Rashi's son-in-law, right? Or grandson? I'm sorry, I forget. One of the two. But and Rashi was much more free with interpreting verses, not as literally, by using Chazal, by using the words of the rabbis and saying that this is what the verse means, and understanding the meaning of the verse according to how the rabbis understood it. The Rashbam was much more outspoken in saying, no, this is the simple meaning of the words, right? And la'olam means forever. That's what it means, right? Yeah, the rabbis had their own way of doing it, and that's fine, but that's not what it actually means.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, we're past the 8 o'clock mark, so for those that want to go to the next lecture, or the 9 o'clock mark, whatever time it is. So everyone have a wonderful, wonderful week. Thank you so much for joining, and looking forward to next week, and have a beautiful, beautiful evening.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks.
Thank you.